In 1971, musician and songwriter Don McLean recorded and released a song titled American Pie. In the lyrics of the song, McLean makes reference to a February day that became known as the day the music died. This is in reference to a 1959 plane crash that killed not only the pilot of the plane, but also 3 iconic musicians and performers of that era. But how did this tragedy actually happen? Delving into this accident, we'll uncover the story of a pilot who was way out of their depth when faced with a horrifying situation. That is what we'll explore today as we delve into what really happened the day the music died. The Tour from Hell was the name given to what was officially known as the Winter Dance Party Tour. Headlining the tour in 1959 was rock and roll musical legend Buddy Holly, supported by other notable artists of the day. They took to the roads across the United States and began performing across the American Midwest in January of that year. Having separated from his band just months earlier, Buddy Holly needed some cash to begin his new life in New York, where his pregnant wife was awaiting his arrival. The tour never got off to a great start. Having to travel on what was effectively a repurposed, unheated school bus in the middle of winter, actually traveling between shows was considered to be a hellish experience. In 1959, the American interstate highway system was in its early days. In fact, most of it was still to be built at that point. Not only were these musicians traveling on a rickety old school bus in the freezing cold, but the careless planning of the tour that saw them darting about the Midwest meant they were traveling across many poorly maintained country roads in perilous journeys to their next show. Multiple buses were reportedly used during the tour's short life. Breakdowns in the bitter cold and the onset of flu symptoms contributed to low morale amongst the musicians. The treacherous conditions between shows frustrated them and was the motivation for Buddy Holly himself to call the shot and charter a plane to avoid another bitter night on the bus. Following a show on February 2, 1959 in Clear Lake, Iowa, the musicians made preparations to travel to their next show in Moorhead, Minnesota. Holly and 2 other of the musicians were to be chauffeured by the manager of the Surf Ballroom venue to Mason City Municipal Airport in the very early minutes of February 3rd. The manager knew a guy who owned an air charter business there. Once there, they'd charter a small plane to fly over to Fargo in North Dakota, the nearest airport to their next show the following night. The 2 other musicians going with Holly on the flight that night included Ritchie Valens. His story involved Valens effectively winning his seat on the flight in a coin flip, taking the place of another musician. And then there was Giles Perry Richardson, otherwise known by his stage name, the Big Bopper. Coming down with a flu, he was offered a spot on the plane. Their entourage and the other musicians also traveling on the tour were to hit the road to Fargo instead. The show ended that night at around midnight. The 3 musicians were taken to the Mason Municipal Airport where they booked a charter flight with a small operator known as Dwyer Flying Service. Dwyer was the name of the owner, one Mr. Hubert Dwyer. A commercial pilot himself, that night, he received and provided weather information for the accident pilot who would take Holly, Valens, and Big Bopper to Fargo, a man by the name of Roger Peterson. Peterson was just 21 years old. Being so young, he was hardly an experienced pilot. He possessed a total of just 711 flight hours by the time of the accident. 128 of those were in the type of plane that was involved in this crash. The plane in question was a small Beechcraft Model 35 Bonanza. The Bonanza is a very popular general aviation and private plane. Over 17,000 of them have been built since their introduction in 1945. It has a distinctive V-shaped tailplane. The pitch and yaw mechanics are integrated into this V structure. The benefits of this are a lighter aircraft and reduced drag due to the less physical surface area that air has to interact with. The Bonanza was seen by many as something of a status symbol amongst private pilots. The unconventional design certainly drew eyes at the airport. The three musicians paid $36 each that night for the flight up to Fargo in North Dakota. There was a problem. Weather conditions in the area weren't looking great. They were in the middle of the Midwestern winter, and it was snowing that night. The forecast for the flight ahead wasn't much better and showed poor weather conditions along the flight route. The first in the contributing factors in this accident was not necessarily the poor weather itself, but rather the poor planning and management at the airport and from the operator that failed to include pertinent information regarding adverse weather conditions. The information that was briefed to pilot Peterson did not include this. Basically, he didn't know how bad the weather he was about to fly into was. Believing that all seemed well enough to go ahead with the flight, the pilot, along with our three musicians, Buddy Holly, Ritchie Valens, and the Big Bopper, boarded the small plane. Going with them was substantial cargo which was loaded into the aircraft. The men were going to use the extra time the flight provided them with to do some laundry in Fargo. At shortly before 1 in the morning, the engine was started and the plane taxied out to the north end of the airport for departure on what was labeled at the time as runway 17. The Beechcraft Bonanza carrying the four men took to the skies, departing to the south at 5 to 1 in the morning. As the small aircraft climbed into the night sky, witnesses on the ground, the air traffic controller, and fans who even followed the men to the airport observed the plane's lights and followed it in the sky. Shortly after takeoff, the plane made a left 180-degree turn to make for their course, a north-northwesterly heading towards North Dakota. Passing east of the airport, ground observers still noted that they saw the plane even in the deteriorating weather conditions. But as the plane flew north of Clear Lake, something else was observed. It appeared as if the plane began descending. Soon, it disappeared. Indeed, it was descending. The plane was in a nose-down attitude and gaining excessive airspeed. Now let's pause here and see if we can shed some light on how pilot Roger Peterson ended up in this situation. Let's put something on the table here. There are different margins of weather classifications. These types of poor weather conditions are what pilots like to call IMC, Instrument Meteorological Conditions. It means that a pilot cannot fly visually in this weather, something this pilot wouldn't really have been able to do well anyway in a dark night sky over a rural region. Instead, pilots would need to fly in reference to their instruments. On that night, sources state that conditions were near IMC. A pilot should probably not attempt to fly visually in this weather and should refer to their instruments for guidance. But instrument flying and being allowed to fly in IMC conditions requires further examinations and certification. And it is here where we begin to understand how the little flight experience of the pilot contributed to this accident. When it came to instrument flying, Peterson's experience amounted to just 52 hours. He was still in training for instrument certification, but he had passed a written examination. Though he had been flying for his company for a few years by that point, he had not fully qualified for flying in instrument meteorological conditions. He was only qualified to fly in visual conditions. He was not in a position to fly whilst only referencing his instruments, something he would have had to do that night. In fact, it wasn't only the pilot who shouldn't have been flying in this weather, but also the company he worked for. Dwyer Flying Service only had permission to operate in visual conditions. The only person in this entire situation who was qualified to make this flight that fateful night was Mr. Hubert Dwyer himself. But he stayed behind. They didn't know how bad the weather was going to be, though. The information they had was insufficient. Let's take a moment here to just highlight the conditions which this pilot was flying under. As a pilot who was only supposed to be flying under visual flight rules, here is what he was dealing with. Flying at night, heading out over a sparsely populated area, there was no ground illumination in this region north of Clear Lake. The deteriorating weather and low cloud base would have obscured any semblance of lighting that he could have picked up. He had no reference to a horizon outside. Peterson, a young, inexperienced pilot, was in conditions ripe for spatial disorientation. Now, that would be where the attitude indicator comes in. And here is the next piece of the puzzle. The attitude indicator is an instrument we have looked at before. It does exactly what it looks like. It's an instrument connected to a gyroscope that can reliably display the information related to the pitch and roll axis. In the center, an icon representing the aircraft facing forward is fixed to the display. For climbing and descending information, the climb region is located on top, typically colored in blue. Let's call this the positive region. The negative descending region is below, colored typically in brown, sometimes black. Now, you probably didn't need me to tell you this. I mean, we have looked at this instrument before on multiple occasions. It's obvious enough, right? But this is an important point, and you'll understand why very soon. We have previously looked at accidents involving spatial disorientation. In relation to the attitude indicator, such as the case of Air India Flight 855, the roll axis was the source of confusion. Now here's the thing. Not all attitude indicators are built equally. When Peterson was training for instrument flying, he was familiar with an attitude indicator similar to the ones that are found on planes today. The accident plane, however, was fitted with something slightly different, and that something looked a little bit like this. This is the Sperry F3. It's an older model gyroscopic attitude indicator. It still gives the artificial horizon as you'd expect. But if we place this side by side to compare it with a modern attitude indicator, such as the one the pilot was familiar with, we see something rather telling. When compared to the modern indicator, the Sperry F3 is inverted. The negative region is on top, and the positive region is on the bottom. These two indicators display the same pitch information, but in opposite ways. It is believed that this was a source of confusion for the accident pilot. All of these factors, when pieced together, paint a picture of an overwhelmed, inexperienced pilot facing spatial disorientation, forced to use an instrument he didn't know how to use. In the dark winter night at around 1 a.m. on February 3, 1959, the plane began descending. Investigators believed that the bad weather made a number of the pilot's instruments unreliable. With nothing to see from the window other than the darkness of night, he went off the unfamiliar attitude indicator. As it was displaying the opposite of what he was used to, instead of flying up, he flew down. It was the opinion of investigators that he had some semblance of control, indicated by a right turn that was done in the final moments of the flight, almost as if he was unaware of what he was actually doing. Seconds later, the aircraft crashed in a nose-down right-bank attitude into a field in Iowa, killing all 4 people on board. North 431313.3, West 932253.1 are the geographic coordinates to where the plane crashed. Once the plane impacted the ground in the field, it cartwheeled to a halt. The pilot remained inside of the aircraft during the crash. The 3 musicians were ejected from the plane. The pilot was supposed to check in on radio with the controllers. As radio calls went unanswered, concern grew that the plane was missing. As the night went on with no sign of the plane, concern only grew further. For 10 hours after the accident, the plane's wreckage just sat there in the field. No one witnessed the crash, and for that time, no one knew it was even there. During those 10 hours, a snowstorm swept over the region. At the break of day, Mr. Hubert Dwyer took to the skies in a search flight following the same route as the aircraft. The crash site was found within minutes. When first responders finally arrived, they discovered the lifeless bodies of the 4 men covered in snow. The manager of the venue the musicians played the night before was called to the accident site to identify the bodies of Buddy Holly, Ritchie Valens, and Giles Perry Richardson. The news then began to spread. The passing of these men was devastating to the music industry. Obviously, this was a big shock to Buddy Holly's pregnant widow. Sadly, she experienced miscarriage, which was believed to have been due to psychological trauma after the accident. Pop music was, in a way, changed forever. In the context of music, some called this the end of the 1950s. A new, rather unheard of phenomenon occurred following Holly's passing. His music shot up in popularity. A memorial now stands at the scene of the disaster, just outside of Clear Lake, Iowa. Fans still pay tributes at this site today. 12 years after the accident in 1971, this tragic event was referenced in the song American Pie, and even borrowed some of Holly's lyrics. The song since then has received critical acclaim, and was quite the cultural hit. Some even going on further to say it's one of the best songs ever written. The accident was now forever known as the day the music died. Hello everyone, thank you so much for watching this video. If you found it to be interesting, be sure to be subscribed as you can expect another video to drop next weekend. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this video. I would say that this is one of the best ones I think I have ever made. I went back and listened to a whole bunch of Buddy Holly whilst making this video. A thank you to my good friend Russell and Aspinall, who performed and recorded the piano version of American Pie you heard in the background of this video. She made it just for this video, so hopefully there will be a link somewhere in the pinned comment if you want to check out her version of that song. Anyway, I should take a moment here to once again thank my amazing patrons over on Patreon for their generous ongoing support. Their names are scrolling on the screen right now, so if you do see your name here, a massive thanks to you. Shout out this week to Tori Cujo for pledging literally just this morning as I record this actually. Thank you so much. Special thanks to Robert Hedges, who pledged at the highest tier this week. What a legend. Thank you so very much. Thank you. If you yourself would like to support the channel further, you can join the Disaster Breakdown Patreon from just £1 per month, and the link to that will be in the pinned comment below. That is all from me today. If you'd like more Disaster Breakdown content, you can check out some of the videos that should be on the screen right now. Thank you for watching, have a great weekend, and I shall see you next week. Goodbye.